can't hear.
Friends.
Maybe it's not turned on up here.
Can't hear.
Hello, friends. That's better. It's much better.
Definitely.
Friends, we might gather and make a start, if that's okay. So my name is Lisa Bridle, and I've been asked to be the MC for today's rally. As we begin, I want to acknowledge that we are gathering on the stolen lands of the Turrbal and Yagara people. Sovereignty over these lands was never ceded. This land always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I want to pay my deepest respects to elders past and present, and extend that respect to any First Nations people present today. There will never be justice in this country without First Nations justice. I also want to acknowledge the resilience of any people from a refugee background who have joined us today. Even after you took a perilous journey to freedom, we have witnessed how you have been demonised and relentlessly punished by successive Australian governments. I want to say publicly on behalf of those gathered here today that we recognise your basic human right to seek asylum, and we see through the hypocrisy of successive governments who have signed UN conventions on all manner of things and yet have locked you up, exiled you to offshore detention, tortured you, or kept you in an endless limbo. For all of those injustices, we say, not in our name, and we are deeply sorry. And even though we are geographically distant, I want to take a moment to send our thoughts and solidarity to the people of Gaza and Palestine, particularly those who are currently under assault in Rafah. They've been forced to flee, becoming refugees in their own land, and countless tens of thousands have been murdered. This struggle for refugee rights here today is the same struggle. A struggle for decency, for humanity, and for human rights. So we are here today because the Labor Party, a party that promised a more humane approach to refugees, this was the spin at least, has again sold refugees out. When I visited my local member, a Labor member in the seat of Griffith, before the last federal election, I was told that their policy did not support mandatory detention. It did not support offshore detention. If you care about refugees, trust us, elect us. We can't do anything from opposition to arrest Dutton's cruelty and bastardry. So while personally I'd heard enough of that spin over the years to not believe it, I know that many of refugees' friends rode the wave of hope with that election, the hope at a Labor or electoral victory, and then to abject disappointment. Despite offering a lifeline to some, Labor has continued to perpetuate grave injustices towards more than 10,000 vulnerable people who have been the most persecuted over more than a decade. And now, yet again, we see Labor's race to the bottom with the introduction of this draconian and cruel bill. The Labor Party we were meant to trust as a party of fairness is a Labor desperately trying to outrun the coalition in a cruel contest in ruthless attacks on refugee rights. Shame.
Shame.
Refugees are still under Labor being constructed as a threat and a burden, not as valued contributors to our society. The proposed entry and deportation bill, the Migration Amendment, Removal and Other Measures Bill, insists that refugees cooperate with their own deportation back to situations that force them to flee in the first place or be locked up. It's forcing them back to situations that are literally death-making. In a desperate and cynical attempt to hold on to psychological torture as a key move in their playbook against refugees, and to avoid judicial decisions unfavourable to their persecution of refugees, this is the rulings against indefinite detention, we see the Labor Party sink even further into immorality. So this supposed difficulty of sending people back to where they came from has been a thorn on the side of our governments, an inconvenient halting to their cruelty. But if passed, these laws will break up families and send victims of past failed refugee practices, such as the fast-track system, back to situations of immense risk. So others will talk about this more fully, but I understand that these laws could apply not just to those currently locked up in detention or on community detention, but to bridging visa holders, including 10,000 asylum seekers rejected under the Coalition's fast-track system, a system that the Labor Party promised to overturn. The bill would impose a jail sentence of up to 5 years and a fine of $93,000 if refugees fail to cooperate. It also gives government powers to impose an entry ban on anyone from a removal concerned country, such as Iran, that does not accept forced deportations. This entry ban is steeped in racism, and it is, for many friends whose visa situation remains unresolved, it means they lose any hope of seeing their mothers and fathers, brothers and sisters again. So before I hand over to our speakers, I just want to draw people's attention to the fact that on these tables there are some leaflets that we want to distribute to the general public, and there's also a QR code which you can use to send an open letter in relation to this bill. So I want to now invite our first speaker, Rita Jabri Markwell, a human rights lawyer and advocate, to come forward. Rita and I have been connected on Facebook through other forms of advocacy for many years, but this is actually the first time we've met face to face, so that's a real joy. So Rita is a key driver of the Australian Muslim Advocacy Network and a lawyer with Birchgrove Legal, and I'll pass over to her to talk more about her advocacy work.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Can I lift this up? All right. Thank you very much. And I want to acknowledge Lisa as someone who constantly lifts my spirits, seeing someone who is not Muslim, not Arab, not brown, who is out there every day speaking because it's the human thing to do. Thank you, Lisa, and thank you every single Australian out there who is like Lisa. Thank you. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm standing on the unceded lands of the Jagera and Turrbal peoples. Labor's deportation bill, disguised as national security, casts a shadow of uncertainty over the fate of thousands of vulnerable Australians. The wide-ranging removal bill's removal pathway direction powers enable the minister to require individuals, known in the bill not as human beings but as removal pathway non-citizens, a group which the minister can expand through delegated legislation in the future, meaning it doesn't require a bill in Parliament, it only requires regulations in the future to expand who is included in this group by any government in the future, to take steps to facilitate their and their children's removal from Australia. Non-compliance with such a direction is an offence. This law seems to make a crime out of survival. The removal bill would allow for such directions to be issued, including in relation to fast-track applicants who were subjected to a review process through the Immigration Assessment Authority, which was demonstrably unfair and is now being abolished. It appears that they may be issued where such persons have a request for ministerial intervention on foot. The third concern is a lack of procedural fairness in the issuing of these directions, the insufficient safeguards that apply to their issue, placing Australia in conflict with its international legal obligations. The very real possibility that the process of issuing a direction itself creates a situation of a real risk of significant harm if a person is removed to that country. The invidious position that parents of children are placed in under directions, having to choose between facilitating their child's removal overseas, despite fears of harm or persecution, or a parent being subject to a mandatory sentence of 12 months for failing to follow the directions, separating their family. A further concern is the inclusion of a mandatory minimum sentence of 12 months for refusing or failing to comply with a removal pathway direction. The proportionality of prescribing a maximum sentence of 5 years imprisonment for failing to comply with such a direction, noting that the failure may involve relatively minor conduct which is not harmful or dangerous. While a reasonable excuse defence applies to the offence, it is not a reasonable excuse that the person has a genuine fear of suffering persecution or significant harm if removed to a particular country, or if they claim to be a person in respect of whom Australia has non-refoulement obligations, or if they believe that they would suffer adverse consequences if required to comply with the direction. None of these things are reasonable excuses under this law. Where foreign countries have previously failed to provide a pathway for persons to be returned, the potential consequences for a person who will be returned are unknown. The removal bill conferral of a personal and discretionary power to designate removal concern countries in the national interest, which will have a punitive effect on nationals from those countries who are seeking to apply for an Australian visa from offshore and would otherwise meet the visa criteria. This will affect people from countries such as Iran, Afghanistan, South Sudan, Russia, Myanmar, and others. The expansion of the Minister's powers to revisit protection findings with respect to broader cohorts, when the existing powers are highly problematic, given their absence of objective criteria, procedural fairness, and an extraordinary degree of discretion granted to the Minister in making such decisions. I'm going to repeat that last one. These broad ministerial powers to revisit findings of protection apply to existing refugees and people who have been granted protection in Australia. People who believe that they are now safe in Australia, whether they have been here for months, for years, or for decades. With a stroke of the pen, families are torn asunder, people are living in fear, voices are suppressed, and individuals are condemned to an ongoing abyss of uncertainty. And what of procedural fairness? It is drowned out by Labor's continuing clamour for unchecked authority. We need to maintain our courage and resolve. I believe that the true measure of our nation's character is being forged right now. in spite of our government's slide into fascist values, as we have seen with this legislation. And I don't use that word lightly. We are sliding into fascist legislation territory. It is completely void of basic procedural fairness and proportionality. It flies in the face with absolute violence in the idea of human rights. It is an appalling shame on the Labor Party. And the Labor Party really now has completely buried any notion that it is a trustworthy political party for people of colour, for migrants and for refugees, and for any Australian that stands for the universality of human rights. Shame. I want to acknowledge that Minister Penny Wong overnight has supported Palestinian full membership of the United Nations. And many people will be celebrating this today. But I also want to acknowledge that this sits in total contradiction to Labor's deportation bill and to its other policies. Albanese's rhetoric on international law is rhetoric. In the past 7 months, Australian defence ministers have announced major deals with Israeli and Israel supplier weapons companies and are exporting major munition stocks to Germany to replenish Germany's stockpile, which is struggling to keep up with Israel's demand. That is our taxpayers' dollars. Recently, the New York Times has reported that Australia is hoping to become the biggest US weapons manufacturer outside the US. The 2018 Defence Export Strategy aims to elevate Australia's defence industry to a top 10 global defence exporter by 2028, in 3 years' time, with Israel identified as a key market. Increasing local manufacturing is a core strategy. None of these things come with a political mandate, a policy justification, or respect for international law. I worry that Labor's deportation bill is not just a political miscalculation by Labor, but it is a sign that many of us have got it wrong when it comes to Labor. This bill could be passed in the next sitting week. Every person who has made this country their home, whether it is a grandma who has fled the Pinochet government of Chile decades ago, or a family who has escaped Iran, Afghanistan, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, or South Sudan in more recent years, their lives are put under a sign that says, your value here as a human is less. No more, we will not absorb these values. These are not our values. Rise up and pressure every member of Parliament to end this bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Rita, for that very sobering analysis of where we are sliding with this fascist bill, and the continuing demonisation and the stripping away of people's humanity by the way they're spoken about in that bill was quite chilling, actually. So thank you. Our second speaker will be well known to many of us, so I'm going to invite Jonathan Sriranganathan, the former Greens mayoral candidate and former kind of local member where I live in the Gabba, to come and speak to us now.
Free, free the refugees!
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 My name is Jonathan Sriranganathan. I'd like to start by acknowledging the rightful owners of the land, the Yagara and Terrible people, recognising that sovereignty was never ceded and that there are many past wrongs and continuing injustices that are yet to be rectified. Thanks, Mike. For those who don't know, my father's a Tamil from northern Sri Lanka, Tamil Elam, and he left because of the conditions that Tamil people were facing there decades ago. The persecution of Tamils continues, and shamefully the Australian government continues to participate and collaborate with the Sri Lankan government, people who've been accused legitimately of war crimes, to lock up and deport Tamil refugees who come here seeking asylum. It is disgusting. And it is part of a much broader pattern of oppression of asylum seekers and refugees across the Western world, but particularly here in Australia. When I was struck a little while ago when Europe was debating whether to introduce similar rules for handling refugees as we have here in Australia, and even a lot of people in Europe were like, no, we can't do what the Australians are doing. Even that's too far for us. And I think that says a lot about the state of refugee policy and immigration policy in this country. For those who haven't worked it out yet, essentially what Labor is trying to do is make it easier to lock up and deport refugees, but they're also trying to persecute anyone who dares to help or support an asylum seeker. They're also trying to go after migrants, after anyone who essentially wasn't born here. I don't want to overstate it, but the effect of this legislation is so broad that it could be used to target almost anyone who wasn't born in this country. The powers that the minister is giving to themselves and to their delegates are so broad, and even the human rights lawyers are saying that this is creeping towards fascism. And I guess the question this prompts us to examine is, what the heck are we doing about this? What are we going to do to step up and apply pressure? And I wanted to start by highlighting that for a long time we've slipped into the framework where we have to say we have a responsibility to protect refugees because refugees are contributing positively to the community. And it's true. So many asylum seekers who come here, they work hard, they pay taxes, they contribute to Australian society. But that's not why we have an obligation to protect and support refugees. We have an obligation to protect and support refugees because they are fleeing persecution. That is the reason. And I worry sometimes that when we focus too much on saying, we have refugees are contributing to society, we set up a presumption or a precondition that people have to earn the right to protection. When in fact there are many people who've come from war zones, who've fled intense persecution, who have severe mental health illnesses, who've been really messed up by their time in Australia's offshore detention centre, who aren't able to work, who in a sort of standard economic neoliberal sense, they're not contributing to the Australian economy the way the capitalist economists would like them to contribute. But that doesn't mean they're any less deserving of protection. Regardless of what job someone's doing, regardless of how much volunteering they're doing at the local PNC, they are entitled to protection here and they should be protected. And I say this and I emphasise this because now what the government is trying to do is create a new framework where some refugees and some asylum seekers are treated as less deserving of protection or support than others, and that migrants are expected to earn the right to safety. And that is disgusting, and that is something that we need to stand against rhetorically and practically and politically here on the streets. And I guess I hasten to emphasise that because for those of us in the movement, I think it's important that we don't slip into that alternative framing of acting like people have to earn or deserve the right to protection. But what's so troubling about this particular move from the Labor Party is that they think they can get away with it, and the broader Australian community doesn't have the bandwidth or the energy to care about it. So many people are struggling to pay the rent, so many people are struggling to put food on the table right now. And Labor is taking advantage of that, and the Conservatives are taking advantage of that. And it's up to all of us to remind people that the struggles and needs of asylum seekers and migrants and refugees are intimately connected to the struggles of Australian citizens and the broader community here. We are all human beings. We all live on the same planet. And their attempts to divide us are nothing more than a cynical ploy to distract from the fact that billionaires are screwing over all of us. We know that, right? That's why they continue to beat up on refugees. That's why they try to keep blaming immigrants for the housing crisis. Right now, ordinary Australians are being screwed over by a broken economic system. Ordinary Australians are being screwed over by billionaires, and the Labor and Liberal parties are trying to say, blame the refugees. That is bullshit. It is utterly unjust, and we should not fall for it. We can see this propaganda a mile away, but a lot of people aren't paying close enough attention, and we need to remind them time and again. They are trying to turn the Australian public against refugees to distract from the fact that big corporations and billionaires are screwing over everyone. So do not allow refugees to become a punching bag. Do not allow them to blame asylum seekers and migrants for the fact that landlords and property investors are ripping off tenants. This is a broader game that the Conservatives are playing. We see this every time the financial crunch starts hitting, every time house prices start getting a little more expensive and people are struggling a little bit more. The political establishment looks for a scapegoat. They look for someone that they can blame to shift responsibility for themselves, and our responsibility is to continually remind people they are trying to blame refugees to let billionaires off the hook. That is the message that the Australian public needs to hear. That is the message that we need to share with our friends and family. It's hard because you want to talk about the technicalities. You want to explain why this particular bill is unjust and why it's unfair, and you go into great detail about how the legislation works. But at a broader level, what's going on here is that they're trying to beat up on refugees so that they don't have to readjust and transform their unjust economic systems. And I think it's really important that we get that message out there, particularly this year. There's a state election coming up later this year. There's a federal election early next year. Start to put that pressure on elected representatives and be willing to experiment with diverse tactics. It's great that we're signing petitions. It's great that we have our rallies in the street. But we need to get creative about different ways to apply pressure on people. We need to be willing to turn outwards to our communities, to organise those meetings in our local networks, to bring this up at dinner table conversations and to talk about it even when people aren't really interested in hearing about immigration policy. We have to be willing to be those loud voices that have uncomfortable conversations, and to remind people once again that billionaires are screwing over everyone, and the Labor Party is trying to blame refugees because they don't want billionaires to cop the blame for the fact that so many people are struggling to put food on the table and are struggling to afford a roof over their head. The last thing I want to say, though, is that borders themselves can only exist with violence. The border of a nation implies and presupposes the violence that is used to enforce it, whether that's a border in another country or the Australian border here. If you support the existence of national borders that keep people out, you also support the use of machine guns and violence to enforce that border. And that's something that we all need to think deeply about. We need to recognise that the border cannot exist without violence. And so if we are against totalitarian violence, if we are against human rights abuses, we need to think about whether we are against borders themselves. And I'll leave you with that consideration to dwell on further. But my view increasingly is that a world with borders that allows profits and commodities to flow freely across the earth, while low-income workers, and particularly people of colour, cannot move from one country to another, is a deeply unjust world. A world where big business can exploit workers in overseas countries, can sell their goods to Australians, but the workers who make those goods can't travel here, is a deeply unjust world. And I dream of a world where one day borders no longer exist. Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan. And I think Rita and Jonathan have both reminded us really of the racism at the heart of this bill, the attempt to divide us and to see some people as less deserving of having their human rights upheld. And I think the issue of this being legislation that is kind of needed because of our kind of national security, we also need to see through that as a lie, and to see the common humanity of all people. So I now want to invite Sudhesh Somu to come forward. Sudhesh has been a friend for a while now and is from the Tamil Diaspora Association of Queensland. Please welcome Sudhesh.
Good morning, everybody. It's really lovely to see everyone come together here to support and be behind us and be beside us in this challenging times that we've been facing. This has been going for quite a long time, and I'm really grateful to see many people come and be part of this process. As we gather here, I respectfully acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land, the Yagara and Turrbal people, whose presence span across the history of time, shaping our past, defining our present, and influencing our future. I extend my heartfelt recognition to the children among us, the torchbearers of our collective destiny. My name is Sudhesh. I come from a Sri Lankan descent, and I stand here in solidarity, embodying the resilience and perseverance of my fellow community. The Tamils, the Iranians, the Iraqis. We face similar injustice. That's what unites us. 11 years ago, I embarked on a journey as a 14-year-old kid, fleeing ravages of war and persecution that plagued my homeland. Little did I know that my path to freedom would be fraught with the shadow of detention center and offshore processing centers, where the echoes of oppression reverberated with every passing day. My story is not unique. It is a testament to the countless individuals who have been stripped of their dignity, their rights, and their humanity due to the scourge of colonization and conflict. Today I stand before you to shed light on the plight of thousands of asylum seekers in Australia, who, after a decade of uncertainty, find themselves at the mercy of government that seeks to further erode their rights and freedom. The proposed bill, veiled in the light of security, threatens to inflict untold harm upon vulnerable and traumatized individuals, exacerbating our suffering and perpetuating a cycle of injustice. There are three key concerns from this bill. Number one is criminalization of asylum seekers. Number two is a failure of the fast-track process, and which was never or fixed essentially. And number three is the separation of families. We must confront the fear-mongering tactics by acknowledging the valuable contribution of the integrated members within our communities. However, the troubling aspect of this new bill lies in the coercion of asylum seekers to return to their countries of origin under the looming threat of imprisonment. By penalizing those who refuse deportation, the bill effectively criminalizes the basic human rights to seek refuge from persecution and violence. It strips asylum seekers from the rights of fundamental rights to safety and protection, plunging us into a life stained by fear and uncertainty. The number two is the failure of fast-tracking process. The fast-track refugee protection assessment process, pushed as a swift solution to complex issues, has instead become a breeding ground for injustice and negligence. Its hasty judgments and inadequate assessment placed thousands at risk of deportation to perilous conditions, betraying the very essence of humanitarianism and compassion. Number three is the separations of families. At its core, the bill threatens to tear apart the fabric of family unity, a bond that serves as a beacon of hope amidst the darkness of displacement. It inflicts irreparable harm upon those who have already endured unimaginable hardship, further compounding their trauma and suffering. It is imperative that we stand united in opposition to this punishing bill, which seeks to trample upon the rights and dignity of asylum seekers in Australia. as a nation founded on the principles of fairness and justice, we cannot pointlessly stand by while the most vulnerable among us are subjected to further harm and indignity. On the other hand, irrespective of one's background, be it black, white, brown, of any kind, if an individual commits an unlawful act, they must be held accountable. Our law exists precisely for that purpose. It is mandatory upon the government to uphold its moral and legal obligation to protect the rights of asylum seekers, to provide them with the support and assistance they so desperately need, and to ensure that no one is left behind in the pursuit of a better, more just world. Together, let us raise our voice in solidarity. Let us demand accountability and compassion, and let us reaffirm our commitment to the inherent dignity and worth of every human being, regardless of their circumstances.
Well said.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sudhesh, for that very moving personal testament to the costs of our unjust immigration system. I now want to invite Mark Gillespie from Refugee Action Collective to address you. Please welcome Mark.
Hi everybody. I'll just acknowledge first that we're standing on Aboriginal land and that this land was never ceded, and I'll acknowledge the traditional owners in Brisbane, the Turrbal people and the Yagara people. Yesterday, excuse me, I've only just put these notes together this morning, so I'm going to be a bit rambly, but yesterday there was a case before the High Court, and an Iranian man who's been in detention for 10 years had his case thrown out. He was arguing that this detention was illegal because the government had no realistic prospect of sending him back to Iran. But the Iranian man was not cooperating with the Australian government, and he wouldn't apply for a visa to go back to Iran. The Iranian government doesn't take forced returns, so the Australian government couldn't return him. So what they did instead was put him in indefinite detention.
Shame.
Now the media and the politicians, when they talk about this case, they focus very much on, well, he was assessed and he failed his assessment. And I think we've got to be very clear that the process of assessment that he went through is very flawed, very unfair. And it's not just me who's saying this, but it's the Amnesty International have criticised it, the Human Rights Law Council have criticised it, the Australian Human Rights Law Centre has criticised it, and many others. Even the Labor Party have criticised it in the past. And it's even in their policy that says that they will abolish it. Now the problem with this fast-tracking process was, first off, the government cut all the legal aid to the refugees. So when the refugees went and applied, made their application for asylum, they didn't have lawyers to help them, and it's complicated. And you do need a lawyer to help you work through this system. And all the organisations that were trying to help refugees were severely overstressed. As well as the government would prevent people from making an application, and then all of a sudden say, you've got to have your application in by a certain amount of time. So they were rushed to get their applications in, and a lot of people, basically messed up their application. The other problem with the processing system is it's written into, the government has written into the legislation what it sees is its obligations to the the refugee conventions that it's signed. So the legislation doesn't refer to the actual the actual refugee conventions, but it refers to the Australian government's interpretations of those obligations. The other thing that it does is that it limits what documents you can put forward to say it's not safe in Iran or it's not safe in Sri Lanka. The government supplies its own documents, and there's limitations on that. And then the other thing that they did is that they removed your ability to, if you fail, if you get a negative finding, for a merits review of the case. It's also, I must be clear, it's also not unfair, it's also discriminatory. People who arrive in this country by plane with a visa, if they make an application for asylum, they go through a completely different system. So you've got two systems, and this system was set up by Scott Morrison in 2014, and it applies only to people who arrive by boat without a valid visa. So you've got two systems. That's wrong. That's discriminatory. There should be that should be got rid of. Okay. The Iranian man who's been in detention for 10 years is a victim of this flawed system. He's a Farli Kurd, a Christian, and bisexual. Now, in Iran, all those people are persecuted. LGBTI people in Iran, you know, they have a death. You know, you could end up. You know, they have a death sentence for people who are LGBTI. And Amnesty International has estimated that since about 1979, more than 5,000 LGBTI people in Iran have been executed. Currently, there's 2 lesbian women in Iran who are on death row. There's also, Iran is the only country in the world where you can end up on death row because of your LGBTI. Now, because of this law, because of the flawed processing, because of this finding in the federal court yesterday, this Iranian man is faced with an impossible choice. He either makes an application and goes back to Iran and faces a possible death sentence, or he stays in detention even longer. And if Labor gets this bill through the Parliament, it can be made even worse because he can be charged and criminalised and actually sent to jail for not cooperating with the government. This just isn't just. And but you know, I think what we have to remember is there's been plenty of times when we haven't gotten justice through the courts. Think about the Moragappan family. They never won one case in the courts, but they are here today in our community with permanent protection and where they should be. They won that through public campaigning, and that's how we're going to have to win this, is through public campaigning. I know it's very small here today, but this is the start. And there's other rallies happening in Sydney and Melbourne. And I think that's what we have to do, is we have to get out there and publicly campaign and explain to people why these laws are unjust. And when we shift public opinion, then we can shift the politicians who make these laws. Thank you.
To the end of our listed speakers, but I just want to check if anyone present here today wanted to say a few words.
I had a discussion this morning with one of my friends at breakfast, mentioning that part of the reason this bill came around is because the High Court released some prisoners who had served their time for the crimes that they had done. That's why the court let them go. And he was somewhat incredulous with that. He said, why don't people say that? And the problem that I see with this bill is that it's not about behaviour, it's about who you are. So the whole bill is targeted towards people who haven't done anything wrong, because if they commit crimes, then they go back to jail for the reason that those crimes were committed. They were released by the High Court because they had served their time. Now we've got a bill coming up that says, not if you behave badly are we going to put you in prison, but it's based on who you are. If you're a refugee, if you come from a country we don't like, and that should scare the heck out of every one of us, because it no longer talks about how we behave, it can be shifted about who you are. And as was articulated rather well before, that who you are can change at the minister's whim. So this bill might target refugees now, it might focus on that 10,000 who are in limbo, but it could so easily be expanded. And that should concern all of us. Thank you.
Is there anyone else before I bring things to a close? No. I just want to thank all our speakers for reminding us about what is at stake here. It is an erosion of any pretense that we are a country of decency, at least at the higher political levels. It is a kind of a reaffirmation, actually, by the major political parties that we are a country that is based on racism and prejudice and discrimination against people who we construct as other. So our numbers are small today, but I just think it's important that we do not lose hope, because we know why our numbers are small. It's because we've been fighting against this injustice for so long. We are small in numbers because people are heartbroken and devastated and overwhelmed by the scale of the injustice that is happening, the scale of the genocide that is happening in Gaza, and they are worn out by decades of fighting for their lives. So, and I guess I also want to acknowledge that many of our friends who support this are not able to be here because they're afraid of the costs of speaking out. They don't want to be highlighted in case they are punished and singled out for really horrendous treatment by our government. So I just want to kind of give a few little announcements. So a reminder that there are kind of the brochures and the QR codes, and there will be further action. So if you're not on the Refugee Action Collective mailing list, or you don't get the Facebook updates, please check that, because there will be future kind of events, ways to become involved and become more active. Before we finish up, we're not going to march today, but we are going to gather and get a photo and have some chants to bring it to an end. But just really, could you please join me in thanking all of our speakers today? So I want to say that even when our numbers are small, we must remember that we are not defeated and we will not be silent. To Albanese and his government, we say, we see and we will remember who you have shown us to be. In the face of this legislation, we say, enough of this contest of cruelty, enough of this racism, enough of this persecution of ordinary human beings. Enough of this blatant disregard for human rights and fairness. So as we leave today, and we might gather, I don't know, where do you want us, Mark?
I think if we go and stand here.
Yeah. So as soon as I finish, we'll go and gather there, have some chants and some photos. But as we leave today, I urge everyone to remember the consequences of this current battle for innocent people. What it will mean if we don't fight this bill. It means people will be sent home to death, certain death, that families will be torn apart, and that there'll be another way in which the struggle for human rights is slowly eroded. So thank you to all who have joined us today. Let's raise our voices again as strongly as we can to say no to this bill and freedom and justice for refugees.